Today I've travelled to Lytham St Anne's and I've been attending the Probe UK Paranormal and UFO Conference, and I'm delighted to speak with Charles Hall, who is a Vietnam vet. He has a master's in nuclear physics and he has had some phenomenal experiences in Nevada. Charles, is that right?
That's correct, yes.
Now, I would just ask viewers to keep an open mind when listening to Charles. He's a very eloquent man, as we found out yesterday when we listened to his talk. Now, if you just start with your, because you were a weather observer, could you tell us what that's about and why do we need weather observers?
Well, thank you for having me on your show. I enlisted in the U.S. Air Force in July 1964, and making a very long story short, I became a weather observer. I was trained to be a weather observer. In the 60s, before the internet and computers, you had to have a person actually go out and measure the winds and look at the clouds and send in wind reports. My job, and plot up weather maps and so on. I was stationed at Nellis Air Force Base, Nevada, outside Las Vegas, Nevada, and from 1965 till May of 1967. And of that time, I spent most of it at the Indian Springs gunnery ranges, northwest of Nellis. They're like 90 miles. Nevada is a big stretch of desert, and it was out in the Indian Springs Valley, which is a desert valley covered with mountains. I discovered that as the weather observer, it was my duty to get up at 3 in the morning and go out to drive out into the desert and release a weather balloon and track it and phone the winds into Nellis. I discovered that at the north end of Indian Springs Valley there is a base that the U.S. Air Force has for extraterrestrials. I named those extraterrestrials the Tall Whites. I described that 2-year stretch that I was out there in my 4-book series, which I've entitled Millennial Hospitality. I have a website, millennialhospitality.com. I'm also millennialhospitality.org, and which has pictures and more information. And the books can be purchased anywhere in the world through Amazon.com or at any bookstore. I tried, in my books, I'm not trying to prove that the extraterrestrials are real. For the first 6 months that I came across them, I thought I was nuts. I refused to accept that I was looking at real flesh and blood creatures who had come here from some planet orbiting a distant star. And so even with them standing in front of me, I found it hard to accept. Took me 6 months to get over the terror and the shock, and what I'm trying to describe in my books is how it felt. I'm trying to describe how that felt for 2 years to go out into the desert knowing that you weren't going to be alone, or having the extraterrestrials come into my barracks at Indian Springs. It was a very tiny base. And, waking up at night with them there. After 2 years, I stopped questioning myself and made friends with a few of them. Each one of them are individuals, just like humans. Their skin is as white as a piece of paper. They have large blue eyes, and throughout most of their life they stand as tall as we do. I describe all that in my books. They have men, women, and children. And most of the time when you were talking with them, I was talking about very ordinary things, such as if I was talking with the young mothers, they were interested in women's fashions, and I had mail order catalogs for Montgomery Ward's and Sears and so on, and many times, or if I was talking about their children, about how healthy their children were. So they weren't. What I'm trying to capture in my books is the shock of it all. I'm also trying to capture the difference between talking with the extraterrestrials and talking with my experiences with my guardian angels. So the books have more than just extraterrestrial things in them. When I was in Vietnam, my good friend Kenneth E. Baker from LaPorte, Texas, willingly gave his life to keep me alive. And so in book 3, there's a large section where I try to capture how that felt, how it was with Baker. It was a very religious experience for him to come and say that that he knew in advance that he was going to die to keep me alive. So they're a very emotional series of books.
So Charles, I just want to ask you about the actual base. So
Yes.
presumably this base was provided by US Black Ops under kind of a veil of secrecy, is that?
When you're on the public highway at Indian Springs, Nevada, which everyone can find in the maps, and as my website shows, when you look north up the valley, there's a group of mountains that are like 45, 50 miles up there. The base is dug in on those mountains, and the Air Force runs that whole section of desert. It's the back door to Area 51. However, it is not itself. It's inside the Area 51 perimeter, but you know, you can the valley is very long, and as you see on the map, very wide, and it's at the northern end of that valley. They've been there for a very long time. The tall whites live much longer than we do. The tall whites live, I estimate, 600 to 800 years. They live about 10 times longer than we do. But they don't age the way we do. When they get to be equivalent to a human, about 40, instead of showing the effects of age, they start growing again. So that throughout most of their life, they're the same height I am, 5'11", but they're all individuals, so there's variation. But then as they get older, they get very tall. I've seen them more than 8.5 and 9 feet tall, but the very old ones get very fragile because their organs do not grow in the same proportion as their skeleton and their muscles. Eventually they get so old and so tall that their organs can no longer support their body and they die of old age. This is not necessarily the benefit you would think, because their body doesn't heal as fast as we do. They're very frail. And like if we fell down and broke a leg, we might be up and about in a month or so, or 6 months, maybe in a bad case a year. But see, if they fell down and broke their leg, they would easily be 5 Earth years before you could see much healing at all. Right. One morning when I was out in the desert, after I'd become friends with a few of them, because they're all individuals, and so, you know, there were people who trusted me and I trusted, and there were people that I'm still terrified of. They're generals. So you had to be very specific about which ones you were interacting with. But one time I scratched myself in the morning, and I was young and healthy in those days, and by the afternoon I was healing up. It had already scabbed over, and I was no longer wearing a Band-Aid or anything. And a group of them came around, and they knew that I had scratched myself in the morning, and seeing that I was already healed in the afternoon, they were shocked. One of the tall white lady visitors was asking their guard, "Are all humans like this?" And their guard was saying, "Yes, they appear to be." And whereas for them, see, that would have been a month just healing up an ordinary scratch. Quite all right.
So you actually named 2 other races. Would you have any idea as to the numbers of tall whites that are at this base?
I don't have any precise numbers, but as I describe in Book 3, in 1966, when the tall white lady, whose CIA name was or whose name that she used for humans was Pamela, when she was trying to pass her final exam to be in the technology transfer program, her final exam required that she walk up to me with all of their instruments turned off and meet me on my terms. And of course, this was after I'd gotten over my fear of them. And to prove that she was meeting me on my terms, she had to turn her back to me and walk around me with her back to me to
Right.
prove that she trusted me. And she was terrified of humans. She was terrified of me, as I describe in Book 3. On that night, I estimate there were between 200 and 500 tall white individuals, men, women, and children, watching her from the mountains to the east, along with several U.S. Air Force generals. and a couple of humans in business suits that I suppose were from the Department of Defense. And so the number of tall whites, while not in the millions, could easily be several thousand, or it's certainly several hundred. A deep spacecraft would the large deep spacecraft, they came in several sizes, would carry as many people as a cruise liner for the Mediterranean or for the Caribbean. And so it wouldn't be unusual for there to be 200 or 300 of them get off a deep spacecraft, although the most I ever actually counted on a deep spacecraft was somewhere between 70 and 90.
Okay. Now, you mentioned technology transfer, and you said in your talk that the agreement was that we provided them with a base in exchange for some of their technology.
That's correct.
And do you know what technology that they imparted to the...
No, I don't. See, I was the weather observer. I was never, I wasn't part of any design program, or I was not part of any reverse engineering program. I was not briefed before I went out there. I was not debriefed. The agreement was that everything I did would never be classified. Weather information is never classified. I understand that during the Korean War, for example, the Americans and the Red Chinese routinely exchanged hourly weather reports all through the Korean War, because it's never classified.
All right.
And see, when I was out there, I had to, everything I learned about them, I had to learn by either observing them or by talking with them. And they never came to teach me anything. They came for their purposes. A common one, about half of the time, was that the mothers would have children who liked to play. I'm the weather observer. I have pretty colored balloons. I release them with lights on at night. I track them. The children loved to come and play where I was. Here on Earth, we can see the stars at night, but I understand that on their home planet, it's bigger than the Earth, and the atmosphere is denser. Night is rare. And I understand that on their home planet, they cannot see the stars at night. One of the things they love to do is to walk around the Indian Springs Valley at night and just look at the stars. Well, they considered it to be an extremely beautiful place. Their home planet is apparently a warm desert-like planet without oceans, but with only large lakes. And see, when they came to where I was, if there was no reason for them to talk with me, they wouldn't. They might just show up with the children might just play, and they might go away and never say good evening, goodbye, we're going, anything. They were that way. They were far more quiet than, say, what you might have expected. They really didn't feel like telling me anything. I mean, I was an enlisted man. I had only 2 stripes and later 3. They knew very well that I was just an enlisted man. If they've ever forgot that, the American generals would be happy to prove it by having me clean a few latrines and show who was given the orders. And so they never came to discuss policy or anything. They came for their purposes. Now, as part of the technology exchange program, they needed they're naturally more afraid of us than we are of them. That when they come here, they have to learn to overcome their fear of us. And see, from their point of view, it was nice to have Charlie out there, the expendable human, I guess. Mm-hmm. And then see, they could practice talking with me and overcoming their fear of humans before they went off to talk to the quality folk, to the people who mattered. Right. According to my logbooks, the 7 years before I was there, more than 41 American airmen were stationed out there as weather observers, each in turn. And every one of them had become compromised. Some of them were so terrified of the ranges, they would not go out to take the weather report. They would simply make them up from the barracks. There were piles of weather reports sent in from Indian Springs that were not worth the paper they were written on. One of the things I'm proud of is that I always went out and took the weather report, even though many nights I was, especially early on, I was absolutely terrified.
Right. So Charles, it's obviously quite a large facility with, as you describe, possibly thousands of beings there. How is this whole program kept secret from the American public and the world? I mean, would it not leak out into media and become a sensational story? How do they manage to keep this under wraps, such a huge secret?
One time It's far easier than what you might think, because people don't expect that. Don't expect that. I wouldn't say there were thousands at the base all the time. The base was used like an airport, and so, you know, when the deep spacecraft would come in, they would be in port for 2 weeks, and the people would get off while the deep spacecraft was being repaired and refueled and refurbished. So the number at the base might vary from as little as the base personnel, perhaps 50, 60 people, to a much larger number, perhaps 1,000. But there was not a lot of people there. But keeping it secret was so easy. One time, my orders were that nobody could ask me any questions. My own commander couldn't. He wasn't told. Only the highest ranking generals knew what was actually up the valley. One time I was trying to tell one of my friends who knew that something was out there. He was one of the maintenance men at Indian Springs, and a few of the maintenance men did know they were out there. But he was one that knew they were out there. He later died in Vietnam. And he looked at me like I was nuts. Another time I was trying to explain to one of my friends down at Nellis, who knew there was something unusual about the valley. I was trying to explain to him what they were. That they were out there. And he thought that I was drunk. He thought that when I went out, and instead of actually listening to what I was saying, as a friend, he cautioned me, saying, remember, you have to be sober when you go out there, you know, just for safe driving. And he thought that instead of there being actual extraterrestrials out there, he thought that I'd just been out there having a beer party or something. So, you didn't have to keep it a secret. You didn't have to do anything. Nobody believed me anyway. Yeah.
All right, and Charles, and now we hear of people who do try and break their official secrets act by telling people what they've seen in black programs. So, is your life not under threat by what you're saying?
The agreement they had with the Tall Whites, as I describe in my books, was that nothing I did would ever be secret. I'm not whistleblowing or anything. When I wrote the books, all I was trying to do was to capture how emotional it was for me and pass it on to my children and my grandchildren. In the books, I'm not arguing any government policy. I'm not advocating any change in whatever the government thinks is appropriate. I'm not even claiming to know all about the program. I'm just trying to capture my experiences in those 2 years, in those 2 years, and with the Tall Whites and with the extraterrestrials that I call the Norwegians with 24 teeth, which I mentioned briefly in book 3. And I'm not, the reason that I wrote the books in novel form is to conceal the names and places, the names of real people. I conceal the names of people, I conceal the places, and distances and so on. So there actually isn't anything in the books that would cause the government any problem.
Because they're written predominantly because they're written in fictional form rather than you're stating it as fact.
That's correct.
Right.
Yes, and I'm not trying, and I don't name any real names. When I went out on the ranges, I took nothing out there except what the government told me to take out there. When I came off the ranges, I brought nothing off the ranges except my memories. I didn't bring any photographs. I did not bring any logbooks or anything. All that belonged to the government.
Why not join me, Richard D. Hall, live for an evening on board the Starship at the Oaken Gates Theatre in Telford, 11th of May 2011. Or on the 23rd of June at Weston-super-Mare's Grand Atlantic Hotel, and on the 29th of September at the Academy Theatre, Barnsley. In the show, I'll be addressing many of the areas I've covered over the past year, including false flag terrorism, UFOs, animal mutilation, the financial crisis, and more. Learn what your government isn't telling you and what your media isn't allowed to tell you. Find venue and ticket details on the richplanet.net website. Further future venues to be arranged.